Mary Lou McDonald, the Sinn Féin president, doesn't see things in quite the same way. When I spoke to her earlier, I asked her first about her own recent experience with COVID-19.
Well, I suppose from a personal perspective, number one, I am at a loss. It's a mystery how I picked this virus up. I was upset to be ill, but upset even at the idea that I had the coronavirus, that I had COVID-19. It is a horrible, vicious virus. It laid me low for a couple of weeks. I mean, the symptoms were many and varied. You hear typically, that it's very high, fever and a cough. And of course, it's a respiratory illness. And I had some of those symptoms, but I had so much more. So it really is not a virus that anybody wants to pick up. I suppose I was very, very lucky, Mark, in that I was not hospitalised. I managed to recover at home. I was doubly lucky in the sense that I'm asthmatic, so I don't have great lungs, and my worry was that I would get into difficulty in that department. But ironically, it was when the virus had exited my system that I got a secondary bacterial pleurisy in my right lung, which was very unpleasant too. But certainly I was just very lucky that came at the end of my sickness rather than in the middle of it. So I feel incredibly grateful, incredibly lucky. Where
do you think Northern Ireland and the Republic are on the much talked about curve at this stage?
Well, we know that I think across the island we have been successful in, as they say, flattening the curve and ensuring that our health services have not been overwhelmed. I think some of the information and the data is encouraging. I think communities, families right across Ireland have rallied magnificently and have certainly heeded the very, very difficult restrictions that have been asked of them. And I think that has had an effect.
Do you accept, though, having said what you've just said, that Northern Ireland and the Republic are clearly on different paths, and both parts of the island need to make decisions that are right for their own people?
Well, I would repeat my point that viruses don't respect borders, Mark. Viruses aren't political. This isn't politics, this is biology, and this is public health. And this virus is highly contagious, easily transmissible. We have no immunity, and the border does not confer on any section of people immunity. And so therefore, for the purposes of keeping people safe and frankly, keeping people alive, there has to be an all-island approach. You're right to say, of course, that particularly in the initial stages, London took a very different approach to Dublin, indeed a very different approach to just about everybody, bar perhaps Sweden, and was talking about things like herd immunity and so on. Thankfully, they have revised that analysis and that approach. That was the right thing to do. Within the executive itself, and here in Irish politics, there was a bit of tension between some colleagues in terms of the right approach to take. I believe that Michelle O'Neill took the right position in arguing for closure of schools and early measures. And I know that caused, required some, difficult conversations with colleagues, but it had to be done. The stakes here are so high.
So she was right to call for schools to close at that stage ahead of other politicians who thought that the time wasn't right.
Absolutely.
Sinn Féin's position on this, though, isn't always consistent, is it? When Michelle O'Neill was calling for schools to close in Northern Ireland because they were closed in the Republic, she said people couldn't understand why they were open on one side of the border and closed just a few miles away. But your position is different on cemeteries, because you think cemeteries should remain closed here in Northern Ireland, but they're open, of course, in the Republic.
Well, this issue of visiting cemeteries, of all the sensitive issues, this and, access to a loved one as they are passing are the two most sensitive and difficult provisions. And I think there is room for a consideration around those provisions in terms of cemeteries. I think Michelle has made clear, and others from the executive, that they will be discussing those matters tomorrow.
So should we prepare for a change of tack from Sinn Féin? Conor Murphy talked today about flexibility within the lockdown rules. Are we going to see Sinn Féin coming out of the executive meeting tomorrow and saying, actually, you do support cemeteries reopening in Northern Ireland?
Well, what you're going to see is Sinn Féin ministers going into the executive firstly and discussing and considering matters with colleagues, because there's a concern right across the board in terms of cemeteries. I'm very, very conscious of it. And then what you will have is a discussion and a decision with the focus on two things that need to be met. On the one hand, the needs, the really human needs of families and people at the most tragic moment of loss for them. But equally to be very, very clear that we can't have, if you like, a complacency setting in, or people adopting a stance or getting the idea that on any part of the island that sure, we've done the heavy lifting and we're out of the place of danger, because that's just not true.
Should they remain open or closed? They're open in the Republic, they're closed currently in Northern Ireland. It seems that Sinn Féin has two different positions on the two different parts of the island at this point. Is that about to change?
You can visit cemeteries in this part of the island, that's right, but people shouldn't imagine that it's just an open regime. That's not true. There are protective measures in place. I think there is a strong case to be made, and I think it will be made tomorrow, for looking at those restrictions in terms of the cemeteries and reflecting the kind of measures that we have here in the south. You see, at times, Mark, to the best of our ability, we look to have an all-Ireland approach and a safe approach. The balance of efforts has been on things like modelling and testing and tracing, the elements that we need to have absolutely right to keep us safe in the here and now, but also to shape and fashion a safe exit from the emergency measures.
Okay.
And then there are times when there are jurisdictional differences, and we seek to iron those out. But the much more important point, Mark, if you don't mind me saying, is that people who now are suffering and who are distraught at the fact that they can't enter a cemetery, those voices have been heard, I know, by my colleagues, and that discussion needs to happen tomorrow around the executive table.
I want to move on to ask you about comments by Declan Kearney, your junior executive minister and indeed your national chairperson, who wrote that right-wing elements in the British cabinet and some unionists in the north of Ireland are encouraging a relaxation of coronavirus restrictions. Do you seriously believe that this can be boiled down to accrued lives versus the economy, as Mr Kearney seemed to be doing?
Well, I'm determined, and we are determined, that does not happen. This is a public health emergency, and health has to come first. I'm as aware as anybody else of the huge hardship for people who have lost their jobs, who have lost hours, who have lost income, for people who have built up businesses and now they feel their backs are to the wall and they wonder about the future. But the measures that have been taken are essential in terms of public health. And just bear in mind, Mark, there were reports today of backbenchers, Tory backbenchers in London, rallying the troops to open the economy up, just with an eye and a focus on the economy. And it seemed with very little regard for the public health imperative. And that can't happen. We need to be very clear. I want people to get back to work. We need to rebuild our economy. We need to ensure that we fund that rebuild correctly. We need to make sure that we use the opportunity to correct for many mistakes of the past. All of that is work that needs to be done across the island, across the continent, and across the globe, indeed.
Yeah. But when Declan Kearney, Mary Lou, with respect, when Declan Kearney writes about this being the typical capitalist reflex which puts the market economy first, corporate greed over public welfare, and he says there are unionists in Northern Ireland who are pushing that policy. Who are those unionists? Is Arlene Foster one of them?
Well, I think you saw those unionists and Tories back at the time when a proposal to award a pay increase to nurses, the heroes of the hour now, was turned down. And in fact, there were cheers from those benches. So very, very rudimentary research would establish who those figures are. And look, this isn't green or orange. This is actually a political debate that is going to unfold. By the way, again, not just in the north.
Declan Kearney identified unionists. He specifically made it an orange and green issue by doing that.
No, I don't accept that. I think it's. I think that's very much born from the fact that unionism up until recently was in a very tight relationship with the Tory party, and people will know. People will be very familiar with the austerity and the cutbacks that the Tories brought, and they will know.
That was a very long time ago in a different world.
It's as they say, plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. Everything changes, and some things remain the same. And the truth is that when we come out of this health emergency, as we will, there will be a debate, a necessary debate around how we rebuild our economy, how we rebuild society.